Welcome to the Crimson Engine. My name is Rubidium. If you can't tell, today we are talking about in-air diffusion, haze versus smoke versus steam, and which diffusion is right for what budget and what kind of project. So haze that we have going here is something you'll find on almost every modern Hollywood film set. It is pretty inexpensive to run. It fills up a room very quickly. It's very importantly, it's safe to breathe, and it hangs in the air for a really long time. The reason people use it is that it gives these wonderful light streaks. It creates space in the air that captures light, that gives this wonderful evocative smoky feeling. It adds depth to your shot because the light has to pass through the haze to get to the sensor or the emulsion. That sort of distorts the light, and the further it travels through the diffusion, the more color and sharpness it loses. So that means me, the subject, is going to be sharper than the background. If you compare this shot to my regular setup, this one feels a lot more cinematic to my eye. It feels a lot more evocative. It's not just, a converted garage in Burbank. It's actually feels like somewhere where a cinematic story is taking place. And, people go overboard with this. Ridley Scott in particular is infamous for putting so much diffusion in every single scene. Even outdoors, there's a scene that I looked at in All the Money in the World where they're just having a casual conversation in the garden, but to get diffusion into the air, they had the gardener burning leaves in the background, which gave them an excuse to, put diffusion through the entire scene, the entire massive backyard of John Paul Getty. It really does add a lot, and it just makes the scene that you're shooting feel like it's in a different world. It transports the viewer because it looks so different to the places that we normally exist in. So there are three common ways to add diffusion to your scene. The first one is this hazer. This is the DF50. It retails for around $1,600, so it's not cheap. It also weighs about 40 pounds. It's not particularly light or easy to transport. It doesn't go through the haze fluid very quickly. The haze fluid is something that you need to keep topped up. A big advantage of this is that it hangs in the air really well. It fills up a room very quickly. I think we ran this thing for less than a minute, and a minute later, once it had diffused through the air, it looked amazing. An option that people try and use is a fog machine. You can get a fog machine, the kind they use at parties and DJs, at your local hardware store from anywhere from like $25 to $100. This uses a different type of liquid, which is much heavier, much denser, and it floods into a space. It gives really thick, cloudy-like fog. This is what they usually use on film sets to double for smoke. It's not as safe to breathe long term. It's oil-based. It's certainly not safe to put around small children or kids for long periods of time, but it dissipates very, very quickly. You put it into the air, it fills up a room, and then almost within 10 or 15 minutes, it'll have settled in a kind of oily substance on the floor, and you'll have to run it again. The reason this isn't ideal for filmmaking is that it's very hard to keep a consistent level of diffusion throughout the scene, whereas a hazer, being 20 times the price, does that really, really well, and that's why it's the main choice. Now, if you're shooting outside, like the Ridley Scott example, diffusion doesn't really work because the wind takes it away so quickly. One alternative is to use a fog machine, or actually use smoke. Use a bee smoker with like wood chips in it. That's a slow burn, and it leaves a much larger trail and lasts for longer. Neither of these can be used in any sort of wind. You need to wait for a perfectly still day or still night. If you're using a fog machine outside and you want the fog to stick low to the ground, like a Michael Jackson Thriller video, you can get a little box that sits at the end of the fog machine that you can place dry ice into. What this does is cool the fog as it's coming out of the fog machine and keep it really low to the ground, so you get that 80s music video horror sort of effect. The final way to get this type of effect in a room, and it's ideally a small room, is use a humidifier or a couple of humidifiers. These are really just machines that use electricity to turn water into water vapor. This is the in-air diffusion effect created by a single humidifier. I let it run overnight for about 6 or 7 hours, and as you can see, it's put a great haze in the air. It blooms out the highlights really nicely, and it's, not only incredibly cheap, it's incredibly safe. It just takes a long time to do. The big advantage of that is that if it's around kids or even babies, like you want to do a scene with a child that the parents weren't happy with you using something like a hazer, water vapor is 100% safe to breathe. It's actually good for you to breathe. The downside is you may need to run a humidifier for hours to fill up the space. I found that if you're going to shoot in a place the first morning, just get a couple of humidifiers, fill them up and leave them on all night. When you walk into the space, if you keep the door closed and there's not too many people moving around and opening doors, the effect will last for about an hour. But then you have another couple of hours to fill it up again. So it really is kind of a DIY solution that's sometimes a last resort, but can really give you what you need. Don't let the $1,500 price tag of the hazer scare you away from using it on your productions. Here in LA, they're about $75 a day to rent. And the one that we got came with its own hazer fluid, so we didn't even need to buy it. It is a really wonderful, long-lasting effect that's pretty consistent. You can run the hazer between takes if you want to keep the level up, but most of the time, like I said, if you run it for about a minute, it will last for about 30 minutes at the same level. It just sort of hangs in the air. One final way to get diffusion in the air is use diffusion in a can. This one's called Fantasy Effects. I actually did a previous video about using this to create light beams like you see here. It is more a photography tool than a filmmaking tool, I found. It says one can last all night when used as directed. It really doesn't put a lot of haze into the air, and that haze doesn't last very long. So if you just want to get a quick shot, get 2 cans of this and have people spray it right before your shot, it's perfect. But if you're doing a couple hours scene, it's very hard to get a consistent level with the handheld hazer. It's much better to get the industrial version, do it properly, and this is why it's become a default on set. That's our look at haze versus fog versus smoke versus steam versus handheld diffusion. Each one has their strengths and weaknesses, but I really recommend experimenting with it and finding the one that's going to work for you. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you next time.